Welcome to the Tension podcast series. I'm your host, Donna Dupont with the Archipelago of Design. Today's podcast is going to focus on the world of serious games. Joining me today is Dr. Philippe Beaulieu-Brossard, professor at the Canadian Forces College, designer, and co-founder of the Archipelago of Design. Welcome. As well as joining me is Scott DeJong, PhD researcher at Concordia University in Montreal, game designer, educator, and public scholar. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
So to start us off, for our audience who may not be familiar with your work and with serious games, so tell us a bit more about your pathway to serious games and what attracted you to the world of gaming.
For sure. I mean, the journey for everyone is unique, and it's actually really fun to hear for everyone. For myself, I can say that I've always been a game designer when I look back being a kid writing up silly house rules for games or things like that. But more formally, I think it started when I became an educator during and through my undergrad, which I did in primary education. So I was working in kindergarten classrooms up to grade 6, and I was trying to bring games into the curriculum and the work that I was doing. From there, more formally, I moved into doing a master's in media studies, where I decided to look at escape rooms as a genre where you could talk about really intense, serious digital issues. So I made a game that talked about echo chambers and filter bubbles online, using an escape room to model that, which was a lot of fun. And then now, today, I'm in my PhD, and I'm continuing that work, looking at board games, tabletop role-playing games, narrative adventure games, and I think today we'll talk a bit about the board game that I made, or the simulations design game I made called Lizards and Lies, which is about conspiracy theory online. And so it's been a trajectory of kind of connecting research and passion with game design and systems thinking.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, I think that you hit something here with research and passion. So for me, it started with passion because I've been playing video games and board games with my family since I'm probably 5, but I never really considered them as a potential medium for research, transferring knowledge, and also bring potential transformation to the players, because I was trained as an academic not to take games seriously and to also be a gamer in the closet. It's not well seen in the academic world to say that you are a gamer, because you're seen as wasting time that you could put in your next masterpiece book, so to speak. And I reached a point in my career and life where the tension was unbearable to live. And this is when I was in Copenhagen as a Marie Curie researcher at the University of Copenhagen. And during the pandemic, I was playing games as I used to, and I played The Last of Us 2. And I found it such a transformative moment for me. It made me realize a lot of things about myself. The games make you really violent. I discovered there are dark places in me that are or can be violent under certain circumstances, and it was extremely powerful in putting me into the perspective of somebody that the game made me totally hate, and make me play the game from that perspective. And there's no other mediums that could have made me go through this transformative moment. And at this point, it was like tension break, and I went to the Archipelago of Design network to say that if we want to practice what we preach, if we believe in providing transformative learning experiences, we need to develop a game. And then the rest is history, but that led to Breakthrough, which is our first game.
Wow. Well, that's an incredible, both of you, incredible pathway to developing games and using games. As you were saying, Philippe, that there's some misconceptions around use of games. And so in terms of the games for transformation, for learning, are these considered like a different style of games? We use the term serious games a lot. What does that mean in the context of the type of work that you do?
Yeah, I think that there is a serious game is a bit of a misnomer, and just in the name express a malaise, right? It basically says to people that, well, we should take games seriously because they are not being taken seriously enough, and you can use it to achieve a specific goal. In our respect, it's more to change perspective and mindsets about a specific topic, right? So I think that there's a lot of misconception there, and also it creates a bit of a bit of a tension where a lot of game designers, they want to make sure that the seriousness of it is preserved throughout. So it may end up in games that are not really fun, and you lose the game aspect of the game. So in general, I would say a serious game is a game that tries to achieve something beyond just play for the sake of play, which is also good in itself. And that also can compare to other mediums like the simulations or the war game. But I would say the serious game is perhaps a bit more flexible as a genre to develop, and maybe more aligned with the sort of tabletop board games and video games that we play casually.
Yeah, and I think you raised some really interesting, like, talking about those lines and boundaries. But one of the things that I also talk about is that, like, as a term, as you mentioned, serious games is kind of fluffy in the sense of it doesn't really boil down into anything specific. When I incorporate it into my dialogue, I refer to games that are serious or games that are trying to achieve a particular goal, which I separate from educational games, which are typically trying to engage with a particular curriculum objective. And so serious games can range from awareness raising approaches to just sitting in something that might be considered more dark or not necessarily fun. For my own uses, and I think that any game can be seen or framed as serious. We can take popular games and we can facilitate them in ways that make them serious and engaging. However, from a design standpoint, I think what makes a game serious is the content that you're trying to engage with in what you're doing, what you're wanting your players to experience, and what you're hoping your players get out of the experience of playing in the game. And so for me, that's kind of where I sit on my lines, but I recognize that different games can be taken up in different ways.
And the other point I would like to add to this is that if you look at the more commercial industry of video game and board game design, it doesn't mean that even if perhaps the key purpose is to develop a fun experience, enjoyable experience, it doesn't mean that there are no serious goals behind them. Like if you look at The Last of Us 2 that I shared, of course, the designers had a transformative goal in mind, but that's not something that they put to the foreground, right? That's something that as designers, they really most likely believed in. Not something that they believe would necessarily sell copies, but that's something that was there. And I think you can find some parallels with the film industry, where a lot of movies may seem super entertaining, but there are a lot of subversive aspect to the movies that may make yourself reconsider something entirely about society by watching this movie. And just real quick, if for everybody who watched Top Gun Maverick, right, the whole relationship between the protagonist and the barmaid that he's going to of course charm and all that is totally reversed if you compare it to the first movie. Like it really forces you to challenge the way you look at relationship between men and women and all that, although it's not a movie about that at all. It's a movie about fighter pilots killing bad guys, right? So I think there's still a way that it's a bit of a false dichotomy between serious games and games for entertainment. It's just the way they message their purpose that is, I would say, different. Yeah.
So different intent, different purpose, and of course different design intentions in the creation of it as well, which is, I think, really important. So if somebody wanted to explore games, like a more of a serious game that has a purpose, like why should they use a game as opposed to a more traditional form of learning or exploring a topic? What does games have to offer that's unique?
I mean, my first answer is what can't games offer is more a way to think about that question. But if we look at any media, whether it's games or movies, as Philippe just mentioned, they all offer very unique ways to engage with content matter. What games do really well is they invite interaction. I'm someone who, I told you before, I am a game designer, and that's the bio we use for this, but I sometimes refer to myself as a play designer, because what I'm looking at is how do people interact with systems, and how do interacting with those systems, whether it's as simple as playing cards in a game of Uno, or as complex as playing a game of Twilight Imperium, for anyone who's familiar with that 6-hour endeavor. How are you choosing to interact with that system? What agency do you have in that system? And in doing so, what do you learn in that process? And so games allow us a chance to engage with particular subject matter, particular storylines, particular content in ways that are relatively safer than engaging with them in person, or relatively distant than engaging with them in person. So it gives us a chance to explore what potential possibilities could come out, our own emotions, or the emotions of others around us as we engage in particular things. And one of the things that I talk about by making board games about digital issues is that it can make it tangible. It makes it physical. It makes it felt. And in doing so, it can ground that learning inside a person or a player so much more.
Yeah, I think that you hit the mark with the keyword agency. I think this is really what differentiates this medium to others, like a PowerPoint presentation or a movie and all that. And it can really make the player reflect about their choices, right? Choice matter and may lead to unintended consequences and all that. And the other point, as Scott put it, is the safe space, right? To experiment, to fail, and learn from the failure as you go. Because especially in the security sector, there's no tolerance to failure at all. But in a game, like, you can experiment, you can fail and learn from those failures. So hopefully you fail less in real life. Also, for me, it's the ultimate art form of the 21st century because it brings together all of the other mediums. Like we were talking about movies, well, you use the same movie techniques, you use the same sound effects, and even original music, artworks, and all that. So it's basically all the best of all of the other mediums put into a single medium that is, I believe, also way more immersive and all that you can, escape in those worlds. And I think that this is key to make an experience that's going to stick with the player, they might remember for years after, if you compare it to other experience like a lecture. Yeah.
I just want to reiterate to our players that Philippe made a really strong point around failure. I think it's not talked enough about in both design conversations, but also by players and educators, that some of the most powerful learning moments in our lives, especially when we're talking about serious games, are when we fail. I mean, I'm sure many of us can think about moments in our day-to-day life where we go home and we lay on the pillow of our bed existentially thinking about how we messed up a conversation or should have done X thing better in the day. And we reflect on those moments and we grow from those moments. And games are a really powerful space to allow us to fail, as Philippe was saying. And it's really important to remember that allowing players to fail is where a lot of the learning and engagement can really come through.
It's interesting. So it sounds like games and just the context of a game environment creates a safe space where people can take a little bit more risk in their decisions and feel, maybe tap into another side of their creativity in order to maybe learn in a different way, which I think is such an incredible experience and significant value added. How important, like when you were designing a game, how important is creating an environment or an experience that allows for the audience to get creative and get into that flow state? Is that an important consideration when you're designing the experience?
You mean for the player to have room for creativity?
Yeah.
And all that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very important from our perspective, and that's why we have a philosophy that is extremely accessible in terms of games, so that there is as much space as possible for the player to use their own interpretation, lens, perspective, and bounce back to one another. So there's not a 20 pages rule booklet to follow and all that, and everything is basically being mediated with the facilitator that basically gauge the realm of the possible. So I think yes, it's key. And when we're talking about system thinking, there's something in games that if you bring together several systems together, it allows even more creativity with the choice of the player, because then they can put these systems into interaction, right? Something that you may not have in other mediums. So one example we can give is Zelda Breath of the Wild, like that many knows the Zelda series. Now it's on Nintendo Switch, and they have so many systems that are interconnected to the point that actually the players are surprising the game designers based on their creativity that they unleash. They create stuff in the games that the designer would never have expected. So that's something I think I think would be a fantastic goal as a designer, if you can create a game where the players can surprise you due to their creativity. Yeah, it's easier said than done, but yeah, that's something to aspire to.
Yeah, and to your point on flow is a a very loaded term in like the academic circles I'm in. You can find countless books and articles of designers and theorists talking about what flow means. And some people will even argue that flow is very subjective to the players, like what brings a player in and hooks them. And I find that from a serious game design, flow, while important, it's also important to break it up. Whereas some of the more AAA famous games, like those free-to-play games that you've probably heard of like League of Legends or Dota, they want their players to be fully immersed in the gameplay the entire time. But when we're trying to challenge how people are thinking through gameplay, it's important to immerse them in the space and then pull them out of it for a second to then have them reflect on it. Because sometimes when you're really embedded in it, when you're in that flow, you're going with the flow, right? And you're not thinking about what the learning content is around you. And so when I'm designing serious games, I'm thinking about flow from a sense of I want to engage my players. I want to give them that creativity to bring them in. But how can I also have them pause for a second, think about what they're doing and reflect on it so that they're not just skirting past the learning goals that are there?
That's really, that's really interesting in terms of just the reflective component to what you are trying to tap into, and just that awareness, enhancing that awareness and breaking up the flow. Philippe, did you have more to add on the flow component?
Yeah, I think, and it's a risk when you really want the game to go beyond entertainment. Is that of course, if the player is really in the flow, the player may not connect the dots on the goals that you have in mind in terms of transformation and all that. So I think that one technique that Scott shared is to have these sort of reflection moments. So for our board game, it's really happened more in the debriefing, and we have actually the facilitator or rapporteur who notes all of the key, let's say, moments, insightful moment about the behavior of players that you can then bring back in the end, and that's where you have all of those aha moments. And we made this decision because we didn't want to break the flow. But of course, perhaps we're losing a bit of the learning potential if we would break it and take the players out of the game to make them realize, some of their biases in play, so that they could perhaps try to bring to awareness those biases for the rest of the game. But that's a choice as a game designer. But that's a risk of many other games where it's actually you lose completely track of the goal, and then it becomes just a game for the sake of playing the game. And it's extremely tricky balance to strike.
Yeah, but it's actually quite interesting that you found a way to find that balance where you really want to engage. You want that creativity. You want them to immerse themselves into the experience, but yet to pause, reflect, and to have awareness into what they're learning. So I think that tension, that balance, sounds like both of your games strive to do that. And also listening to both of your games really look at system complexity, because oftentimes the average person, when they deal with complex systems or anything complicated, they don't even know how to approach it. So it sounds like both of your games provide an entryway to explore complexity in a very safe but a more enjoyable way. What do you think about that? Was that part of the initial intention behind your design?
I mean, I like that you use the word enjoyable, because sometimes people, when they look at complex systems, are like, I want to smack my head against a wall. But I like to think that playing the game can be enjoyable. It's definitely a point of consideration. I mean, I come out of the education space, as I mentioned before, and I work in the communication studies area. And when we're looking at educational games, I'm sure all of us are familiar with those math games that are just worksheets back on a computer, or they're very simple processes where you get like a point or a star for answering a question correctly and we move on, right? Those edutainment or gamified learning experiences. And while those have merit and have some value in certain places, when we're talking about complex issues, right? So the game that I made, Lizards and Lies, talks about disinformation. That's not something that has a singular answer. It's not something that has a binary response. And because of that, it's how do we design models that can not just simplify it, because you don't want to get rid of levels of complexity, but make it at players' level so that they're only engaging with a chunk at it. And so Lizards and Lions, when you sit down, there's text, there's cards, there's tokens, but you're only focusing on your own objectives. You're only focusing on your own cards. And while what the other players are doing is different than you, and that adds a level of complexity, it also allows you to focus on what aspect of the system, what slice of this disinformation pie am I trying to address? And in that, the joy hopefully comes out through trying to address that goal most effectively, or to the way that you think it should be seen as a player. And in that process, I also look to encourage players to reflect and learn, once again, kind of bringing it back to that.
Yeah, and I think in a similar way, if you look at the breakthrough, I mean, it was one of the key objectives is to make the player more comfortable with this idea of complexity and the unknown and all that, especially for an audience of security professionals, because security professionals are trained to try to simplify, the reality, to be able to advise or make decision. Like at some point you have no choice, and for us it's more to bring back to say, yes, you need to be more comfortable with complexity and navigate it, and then you're going to be in a better position to make it a decision. So and actually the game is actually a complexity simulator, if you will, because it put the players into the role of an investigator who tries to unravel a mystery. And actually the mystery, in the end, no spoiler alert, but it's a complex system that is at work with so many stakeholders that are all interrelated and all that. And at the end of the game, as a result, the player is more comfortable with the messiness, if you will, of a complex system, and come to awareness that their perspective is just one perspective among many on what happened in this complex system. So I think it's a fantastic way to learn systems that we live by experiencing them instead of just trying to learn about them in books.
Yeah, I think you mentioned like messy, right? And complex systems, a lot of the issues that we're worried about and talking about, the reason there's polarized and they're ideologically divided and people have so many opinions on them is because they're messy, depending on whose perspective you're talking to or what background information you're coming to it with or what articles you're even reading to learn about it. When we talk about news stories, it's a messy space of stakeholders and ideas and politics and culture. And so what games can do well, these complex games, yes, these games are complex, but they're trying to make sense of that mess. They're trying to pull pieces. And no game is perfect. No game is ever going to get every single avenue and direction there. But they're at least going to pull some of those pieces out of that mud and make them clear for the players, so then we can talk about them. We can engage in them. We can talk about the different angles that sit there and why people are acting a certain way or why certain decisions are being made. And so I think viewing games as kind of making sense of the mess is a really nice way to put it.
Yeah, definitely complex systems are very messy and in itself has a lot of tensions to navigate. So when you're facilitating your game, what types of tensions do you notice, like that players experience as they're exploring this complex system?
The nicest, I think, comment we received on Breakthrough is that we found a way to teach in a non-judgmental way biases. And actually, you can see from an external perspective all of our cognitive biases at work as the players try to unravel the mystery, because they rely on very, very limited information. So a tension that we see, one of them is when they start the investigation, is the instinct to follow a rabbit hole, to really get as much information as possible on just one single, let's say, actor, we'll say Russia, for instance. And then the players may really lose the big picture that they need to really proceed with the game. So we really see this tension between, the preserving an holistic perspective of reality and drilling down to a more reductionist perspective to really know well the parts before making a decision. And you can really see the professional biases of players. Those who are really analysts, especially intelligence analysts, are being rewarded to really go into the details. So they may fall more into that trap. The other one that we see a lot is the tension between problem and solution. most players will already know from the first phase of the game that, oh, this is probably the mystery and here's the solution, while the game kind of force them to stick in a space for them to understand more fully the problem before going to solution. So these are, I would say, two main core tensions that you can see in the game, and that, of course, we play with, not to torture the player, but for them to make them learn about those.
Yeah, and to think about tensions, I like to break it into design tensions versus player tensions. And so in making a game about disinformation, I was very cognizant that there was going to be, as Philippe kind of just mentioned in their own work, of like pre-consistent expectations and biases coming into the game. And so especially for something as politically charged as fake news, conspiracy theory, which is what the game's getting at, it was like, well, how can we design already around the fact that these tensions will be at the table to avoid them? And so certain things are in the game where the conspiracy theories that you're spreading are meant to be silly and not overly believed in by the average player, so that you're not creating political tensions at the table. We decentered content from the game. So while content exists in the game through tokens, it's not like you're looking at particular news articles or posts that you're making your own opinions and you have your own opinions on the stories being told. There is a narrative in the game, but it's overarching that's meant to frame the actions you're taking. And so that's how you can think about tensions in design. But when, to your question of like players in the game itself, there are still tensions in the space. So the game has you either spreading conspiracy theory or removing it. And you have players who will talk about how they feel about, manipulating audiences or trying to engage with false news in certain groups, and like the mwahaha maniacal villains that they become, or the like, well, I kind of don't want to win. Like, I want the good guys to win, but I'm going to win if I do this. And so they have these kind of moral tensions that come up in the gameplay. But I love that happens. Like, I love when players look at your system and they're like, I don't know if I agree with this, or like, I'm struggle to face something about myself in this. Because when that happens, and this is why I'm a big proponent of like reflexive and reflective design, it encourages them to think about like, why are you struggling right now? Or why are you engaging in this tension? And so you can't stop players from having their opinions and beliefs. And in fact, you should encourage them. It's just, how do you design it so that when they come out, they're not framed in ways that are combative, but in ways that are progressive or allow for kind of reflexivity.
Yeah, very good. That's so interesting. I love the fact that that both of your games really it allows the player to really, they have to dive deep into the tension. And when you think about design, the tension is so important, because those were all where the opportunities are for new ideas, new thinking, and certainly when you go to the reflective part of your activity, you get to learn a bit about that. When you do your debriefs or your reflective activity, what are some of those key lessons that come out? Are there any themes that you've noticed in those that engage with your games?
Well, surprisingly, or perhaps less so surprisingly, the first theme is to bring to awareness the way the group organize itself and think as a group, and surprisingly, most groups who start playing the game don't take the time to properly say, okay, how do we want to run this? Like, who does what, and what are who is good in what and stuff like that. Usually, the players just try to dive into the game and go as fast as possible, but by not taking this moment. And it became sort of a key lessons learned for many people who play the game. It's like every time we do teamwork on a complex problem, we should just sit down and just think about how do we want to organize ourselves, and instead of just diving right into the world. So that may be easy, but that's one that we didn't see before we were playing the game that came up as well. How do you organize and manage the information with your team? And how the way you manage information will make a lot of difference in the perspective and outcomes that you're going to get. So that's a core part of the debrief that we have. The other one, as I talked before, is about the biases in sense making and the way the player try to understand what is going on in the situation. And the very last one is the relationship between problem and solutions. The fact that once we decided what the problem is, it really put blinders on our eyes about the solutions. And it's good to actually do a lot of ping pong between the way we see the problem and the way we see the solutions. And that once we think we know what the problem is. We should not jump to conclusion and not go back. Like we should, as we work on a project, we should always go back and forth. Otherwise, we may put, as we say, our ladder on the wrong wall in the end. So, and just this for me to have developed a game that has all of those lessons learned is extremely powerful, especially for people who have not been exposed to those fundamentals before. So that was really the key to introduce these fundamentals in a way that you experience them, and then after that, as a player, you have a aha moment. And then when you go back to work, hopefully some of that stick when you face some complex problems.
Yeah, I love a good aha moment in the game when you see a player kind of connect with the material and then they're like really into it, or they're really about to talk about how their own life experiences tie in. You know that you've been effective in kind of reaching them in that space. And so for me, I mean, I've had debriefs with 16-year-olds up to like 70, 80-year-olds about kind of disinformation in their lives and how it comes up. And those are always really meaningful moments. But the aha moment always happens when you sit down, and I mentioned before, they have their slice of the pie. And so when they sit down and they start talking about their slice of the pie, how they were able to succeed or fail in the system that they were playing in, and then someone else was like, well, that's because I did this, or that's because I couldn't do this. And all of a sudden they start to connect how these issues, the layers that are there. And so one of the key things for me is I love seeing players peel back the layers of, it wasn't just because someone posted a meme on Reddit that this content spread, but it was a coordinated campaign where these communities were primed to gain disinformation. There were actors pushing it for other agendas or goals. And seeing players connect how their actions had a ripple effect in a system to someone else's actions is where I've really found those reflective pieces to be most successful and powerful. The one that I still sit on beyond that is also players talk a lot at the end of the game about how they would implement this. Because I will be honest, the game takes about 2 hours to play. And that's not feasible for classroom teachers to use. It might be feasible for a university lecturer to use, but you don't always got 2 hours in your day to run a game with your students. And so there's a lot of questions, and we're talking about tensions about how do we make effective tools that can either fit within or even challenge the spaces where they're supposed to run. If you're able to, run workshops with people, it's okay because you can be like, book off the afternoon and come play this game. But if you're trying to partner with these communities that need these resources, it becomes how do we then shift or alter these tools to fit with them? And that's like a separate tension that comes up with players being like, I really enjoyed this, but now I want to use it and I want to figure out how. And then we have great conversations about that.
I like that bridge between enjoying the game, learning, having new aha moments that you can take back to the real world and implementation. So thinking about just impact and taking it, the insights to the real world. When you think about using games, for specific goals, how can some of the insights from these games be used, like in, I guess, an organization? How can they mobilize it? I'm thinking more about translating some of those insights into real-world application. How does that happen? And is that something that you have to intentionally cultivate right from the beginning?
Yeah, I think that, it can happen in many ways. Like I think our hope is that it happens at the self-development level, that the player will realize a lot of aspects about the way they look at reality and engage with their team and all that. In team building as well, I think there's a lot of insights that come into this to what you can do to have a team that is a bit more healthy. And I would say that usually we use also breakthrough as the icebreaker to a series of activities, right? And what we observe is that if we, after that, work on a real project that the organization is focused on, let's say modernizing their unit or something like that, the way they approach the problem is then totally different. They are way more open to complexity. They tend to think way more outside the box after this experience. So breakthrough can act as this sort of catalyst for an organization to accelerate on a challenge that they are facing, right? So that's it would not be directly tied to each organization, but that's the case. And the third one is because it's a scenario taking place in the Canadian Arctic in 2040. Well, a lot of players that are playing the game realize a lot of political dynamics, social dynamics that may occur in the future that are plausible. And if they work in this area, they tend to be way more sensible to those realities, right? And in the game, it's the scenario where Canada decided to really tap into the potential of the Northwest Passage, and we're basically living all of the consequences of this, right? So a lot of players who may want to work, who are working on the Arctic after that, may have a different perspective on several issues that are tied to the Northwest Passage and communities and all that.
I really love that you frame it around how the players, the individuals who play the game, kind of leave the table. Because when we get to conversations of metrics, this is kind of what the question that you're asking is about, I have a lot of concerns with how people say their game is successful or unsuccessful, right? From a commercial side, it's like number of units sold. And that makes sense if you have, shareholders and you're trying to make the bottom line. Educationally speaking, we can find studies that are like, I tested players before a game about subject matter X. They didn't know much. Then they played my game and I tested them after. And guess what? They learned something. But that's an inherently, in my opinion, flawed approach to proving your point, because you could say to anyone, what do you know about this thing? Okay, I'm going to tell you about it in some capacity, whether it's a game or a movie or a lecture. Guess what? They've probably learned something if you test them. And so, you have some metrics growth where people are now doing long-term testing of like 3 weeks, 3 months. I haven't seen one that says 3 years because academic cycles don't work that way, but I would love to see one that says 3 years. But at the end of the day, I think those kind of metrics are actually really hard to prove the success of a game. Like, people love numbers, and I know that people love numbers, but at the end of the day, it's what the individual has gotten out of the experience and how that individual can either reflect on it because it comes up to their mind because they're reminded about it in the future, or how they take their excitement from that game moment and then have that fire that they left with catch on with their team. And because these games are complex, they talk about so many themes and so many issues that players are going to leave with something personal to them that's different than what another player might leave with. And because of that, when they talk about that game or they talk about that moment, they might reflect on it. And for me, when I talk about like learning and knowledge, it's a long form process. Most of us can't remember the day we learned to read because it's steps of learning your sounds and learning your letters and learning to recognize symbols. And eventually you start to practice and put it all together. And games are part of that learning process. And so when we're talking about these intense cultural, complex social issues, there's no one moment where you learn all the answers to it because even the game doesn't have all the answers to it. But this is a step in forming that understanding and interpretation of it. And it's hopefully a step that's engaging enough that they keep reflecting on it and come back to it. And you see that when players reach out to you again, or when you talk to them again, they're like, oh yeah, I remember that game when this happened, right? And those moments stick with them.
And to go on metrics, I think it's a necessary evil because of, if we want to have an impact on, in our case, national security organizations, these organizations work with metric, right? They are accountable and all that. And that's why I don't have the answer yet, but I'm very curious as a researcher, like, is there a way we might design metrics that make sense for transformative games? I don't think we have a satisfactory answer right now, but I think there's a way we can develop metrics that are more to capture intangible and transformative aspects. And it pains me to say this. Like, I would love that it would not be the case and that we could just focus on the long-term benefits of them and just perhaps re-engaging the player after 6 months, a year, whatever, and see if they realize the connection. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. Even if myself as a game designer, I'm already extremely, I have the feeling of accomplishment just by talking about the players and they're receiving their feedback after and all that. Personally, I don't need more than that. Mission accomplished. But I know that the organizations that we work with needs a bit more than that. So that's why at the Archipelago of Design, metrics is a research axis, if you will, that we want to focus on in games for the next 5 years or so, to be able to come to something that is satisfactory and that is not just a gimmick to say that, oh, it worked or something like that. And I think there's a lot of work that has been done in cognitive psychology on this as well that we need to get more informed about.
Yeah, and I just want to add that like this is a problem across games, but it's more specific to analog games. Like digital games, they'll run their metrics behind the screen. Like players aren't seeing, but a lot of the educational games that I've looked at, they'll collect like how long it takes players to click or solve a question or what players input and then delete. And you can't really do that on a board game or like on a tabletop matrix game or something, because it's much more physical, it's much more intangible in the sense of it's happening in real time. And so you're totally right that like we need to find successful ways to do metrics, because otherwise it's really hard to validate them, whether it's for grants or bodies that we're working with. They want to see the numbers of success. And so for me, luckily, I'm not beholden to those numbers in the same way as a grad student. And so I look at my success as documented through receptivity from the players, not on what they learned, but how they felt about the system and how they engaged with the system. Because I've had players like leave a game experience with me and go, I learned nothing. And I was like, great, that makes me feel really good as a designer. And then I met with them weeks later and I was like talking to them about like the game experience. I was like, I'm working on it still. I'm making some changes. Like, oh, well, I was really thinking about it. I was talking to my grandma about it. I'm like, okay, so there was still a lasting moment, right? But as you're saying, Philippe, we don't have a way to measure that. And right now, maybe psychology has some answers, but they're not really being brought into game design in ways that I'm seeing are tangible to work with. But if people listening have an answer, please let me know.
Yeah, and there's an interesting story here. I will not mention the organization, but one of our most, I would say, challenging facilitated session of breakthrough ended up with there was one group that really it was not a good day for them. They were extremely tired and all that, and it really fell flat with them. To the point that in the end, when we went to the debriefing and I shared, okay, here are like the key learning objectives that you achieved, you went through and all that. And one of the players was very, challenging me, saying, oh, it's just this. We spent an entire day on your game and all of those 3 learning objectives, we already know that. And then what I learned is that a week later, the same person became a total fan of the game, because it took like a week for the player to process the experience and let it percolate and all that. So that's why I think, and that's important also for game designer to take the feedback at different moment, during the game, after the game, and perhaps even 1 week, 2 weeks after, so that you can really know if you design in a way that makes it transformative.
That makes sense, because it probably takes time for people to process the experience, and if they keep reflecting on it and going back to it, obviously something resonated, and perhaps over time that it becomes more clear the value they received from that, which is really interesting in terms of, perhaps that can inspire different ways of how we measure success from a game. And it doesn't necessarily have to look like very specific metrics. It could look very different. But as I listen to both of you, I can't help but be reminded of like the importance of a learning organization, because I see that's what both of you are doing. And both of you talk to components of that, like around the mental models and the biases and being very aware of that, individual learning and mastery, right, of complexity and engagement system, and also team learning. And so those are really important components of organizational learning. Like how does an organization continue to learn? And in today's environment, where things are really complex, uncertain, and volatile, we have to continuously learn and unlearn and relearn. So I feel like both of your games are helping people rewire their mindset around complexity and learning how to engage with complexity and learning how to do that in a form of teams. Do you think perhaps there could be success measures or indicators built around organizational learning for games?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that we need to become on our side more familiar with those fields and the achievement they did. One point that resonated with me that you just shared is unlearning, and yes, I think that our game is really focused on unlearning a lot of thinking patterns and all that as security professionals climb up the ladders and reach the executive level and all that. And this notion of unlearning is very counterintuitive to a lot of people, because it's like, hey, I mean, we prefer to have the vision, the perspective of knowledge that we're just piling up, and as we grow and become older, we now are sitting on a Mount Everest of knowledge. But actually, as we grow, well, everything changes around us and in us, and if we don't unlearn some of that knowledge, it's going to lead us to take bad decisions and all that. So I think that more games who can contribute not only to learning but unlearning would be extremely beneficial, right?
Yeah, one of the concepts in disinformation studies is this idea of deep stories, which are these worldviews or lenses that shape how people see the world around them. And it's why you have conspiracy groups that have these, they'll look at the same facts as you and I, but they'll come to vastly different conclusions because their deep stories, how they're engaging with that narrative, shifts how they're interpreting what they're looking at. And to unlearning, it's like, how do we get people to challenge kind of these preconceived notions? I mean, we have these organizations that are working, but are they working to the best that they could be working? And that isn't to say that I'm against, education systems, or I'm against certain organizations existing. I'm just saying, can we improve them, and can we use games as tools to do that? And so this idea of unlearning through games, what a game lets you do is it lets you sit and ask those really weird, awkward, sometimes, you're not always comfortable to ask questions, because you're doing so through a different device, through a medium that allows it to not necessarily get you in trouble, because you're in a space where you can challenge that. And part of it's like creating just space for that, but part of it's using the game as a way to encourage that, right? So in talking about disinformation through your gameplay, Lizards and Lies is meant to just kind of show how these systems work. But in reflecting on those systems, then you can ask them, well, where are you in this system? Where are you in this process? Where are your ideologies and pieces in this puzzle? And it forces kind of a reconceptualization of self. One of the notions that I keep looking towards is this idea of intellectual humility, or this idea of being aware of your own worldviews or lenses. So I say being aware of those own deep stories. And how do we use games to challenge that, so that we can create transformation, or we can create change within these spaces that are so convoluted? I mean, knowledge, understanding, it's so deeply tied to what we've been told, what we've been taught, what we experience, what we've read online, that challenging that requires just chipping away at just our perspectives and how they've been solidified, so that we're not some dense, secure in our opinion, but we're actually malleable. We're open to being shifted and morphed and thinking about it from different angles. And games encourage you naturally to think from different angles. So they're great tools for doing that.
I love that piece you mentioned around the deep story and that narrative, because when you think about design and you think about transformative systems, a lot of people work on the system, the surface level, but if you really want to transform a system, you got to go deep into the mental model, but in the story, and being able to understand that story and understand how to transform that narrative and that language. So that's really powerful, because if games can do that, then it's the starting point for transformation, right? New ideas, new mental models to shape new ways of thinking and being, moving into the future, which is exactly what a lot of organizations are looking for these days.
Yeah, and at the same time, like we need to be mindful that there are limits as well. Like it's, I remember Rex Brynan, professor at McGill, who's the leading expert on, I would say, on the serious game and war games for defense and security in Canada. Like it's not the magic one, right? And it's not going to work with everybody, right? With some particular individuals, maybe very effective. For others, no. So it's totally fine. Like for me, I have a way more sort of transmedia perspective on this. Is like whatever work. Like if for somebody is to go into scenarios, or is to read a novel or whatever, well, go for it, right? But I think that the game really complement all of this sort of system of mediums that we can use to bring awareness to several issues.
I'm really glad that you said that, because I feel like I've been sitting here and I've been sharing kind of my thoughts and perspectives and experience and knowledge, but it's important to remember that games aren't the be all end all. Like I love games, I see their potential, but one of the first things I sit down when I consult with people on game design is I go, why do you actually want a game here? And is games actually the right answer for what you're trying to do here? Games are amazing and they can do really incredible things, but they're not the be all end all of transformative success. They can help in that process, but you also have to have people on board. You have to know what you're looking for in that process and what angles and directions you want to take. So I'm really glad that you were like, it's not a one-time response, because in my work, I was presenting at a conference about my analysis of existing educational games and how they're all very repetitive when it comes to like media literacy. And I had someone in the crowd like raise their hand and seriously ask me, they're like, so now that you know this, can you not just make like one game that we can teach all students and like they'll all become media literate? And I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. Like games aren't like a hypodermic needle that we can just inject into the population and fix the problem. Games are one tool in our arsenal, and a tool that I think so far has been underused for engaging people and audiences in these spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's a tool, and it's a tool that can give you different kinds of results depending on the audience, their openness, their receptivity, and it allows for creativity, right? And new ways of thinking, which I think is quite powerful. So if someone wants to experience a game, where do they start? What opportunities are available?
I mean, first off, there are lots of people who play games, and I'm sure most people know someone in their life who can play a game that they can be like, can you teach me some games? If you're asking from a question of design, my answer is always just start doing it. Be like, if you're interested in designing something, sit in it, get some knowledge on what you want to design. Like, you don't need to be an expert for prototypes, but you need to have some understanding of what you're trying to design around when it's a serious issue, and then just start making. One of the things that I do is I always make a grid on paper. Typically, I do 25 squares. And I give myself 25 minutes and 1 minute per square. And I go, one idea per minute for this game that I want to work on. And then I can sit back and I can reflect on that. And then I can start making paper prototypes and paper ideas. And I know that might sound intimidating for the non-designers or non-experts in the space. And so I perhaps suggest start with playing what's out there. And so some of the ways to find them, I mean, there's repositories like the Games for Change Festival in New York, which does sometimes bleed that serious educational edutainment line sometimes, but they have a website full of games that sit there, which are good examples to look at least what are some things being done. Probably where you're living, there are people who play games in your city. Whether it's a small town or a big city, there are probably groups who are actively engaging with games, and they can either point you in the right direction if you want to look to them that way, but there might even be clubs or groups that run game jams. So I'm in Montreal. There's a group called Gamerella that runs game jams for people who have never learned games before, who are from vulnerable or marginalized communities, to give them a chance to learn the basics. And I'm talking like, they leave that jam after 3 days with like an actual playable prototype of a game, because it's just sitting down and wrestling what they want to make and just digging into it. And so the real short answer is just do it. But if you're worried about that, then find a few support networks to help you kind of step your foot in the water.
Yeah, I think that, two things here. You have, of course, you can play serious games, or you can also design serious games. And another tension or paradox is that I think that it's way more transformative to design a game than to play a game, right? Because you will learn a lot about yourself, your biases. You will also learn a lot about others and how they might play. Because when you design a game, you want to give choice, agency to the players. You are no longer in control, and the player will do things that you never anticipated. Or when we talk about the fun, well, there's no algorithm or magic recipe to make something fun. You may develop something that you think is going to be fun, but it may totally be boring to other players. So the act of just trying to design a game is a very humbling experience, and is totally transformational as well, and also create a lot of incentives to learn about a lot of materials depending on what your game's the topic is on, right? So that's one thing. And for us, of course, a little plug here, but at the Archipelago of Design, we base all of our games on crowdsourcing and on doing these workshops where everybody is welcome, everybody can contribute. Like, there's no everybody can be an expert when it comes to game design because they bring a specific perspective. And a game is so complex with so many parts that nobody can claim that they master all of those parts. So that's why it's very conducive to, I would say, collaboration. And not only every time we are organizing those workshops, I always come with preconceived ideas of what the game should be, and usually they are totally shattered after. So just to tell you how effective it is in terms of game design as well. And we post them always on our events, let's see, a web page. So stay tuned for that. It's always open. And as Scott mentioned, there is a huge communities online. We have connections north and next gen that is also with the younger populations or design games. So there's more and more opportunities, and clearly there's no other way than just trying. Like, it's not something that you learn in theory and all that. I think it's all good, but you need to really get your hand dirty and start prototyping, asking for playtester feedback, and that's when you realize that you were wrong and you gotta start over. So, and for serious games in general, I don't think there is an equivalent to Board Game Geek for tabletop, where they have all of the repository of almost the tabletop games available. But that's something that would be very useful to have. But I think that for any topic that you want to look at, there's somebody who attempted to design a game about it, right? I remember, Scott, during your campfire, you mentioned that for disinformation, now we reach how many games that you...
I have now played 57 different media literacy games. Most of them aren't exciting, but if you want the list, you can email me.
Yeah, there you go. So just to tell you that sometimes we don't even think about it. Like if there are some curriculum development professionals that are listening to this podcast, you usually are reflex to just go to find an article or a magazine or a book. Like, no, we should add this as part of our research when we develop a program, whatever, to look at games that may exist on the topic. And I'm sure they may not be all good, but at least we need to start somewhere.
Thank you both. So before we wrap up this podcast, I just want to know, do you have any final thoughts? Are there anything that we haven't touched on that you think is really important for our audience to know around games?
Well, when I talk about serious games and when we talk about tension, which was, the name of the podcast, there's so many things that I could sit on and talk about, but I think it's important to recognize, and I think we have somewhat emphasized it in our conversation, but serious games are really cool. They're really effective, what they can be, but they're really underutilized, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I mentioned earlier, the challenges of implementing them into classrooms, but also, just as Philippe mentioned, the biases that come with the idea that we're going to play a game about X subject matter. And I think it's just really important to be aware of that. This is a really impactful space, but there's a lot of roadblocks we have to get through. Alone, trying to get funding from different bodies to try to make these games possible is a real challenge, because when they read on their grant application that you're making a game as opposed to a policy report, they might not always buy in. However, I will say a game can lead to a policy report, and some of those policy reports are incredible. So for any listener, remember that.
And vice versa. You can use a game to familiarize people with the insights of a policy report. So it's not isolated for sure. What was very stimulating about Breakthrough is that we started from not knowing an answer to the challenge of developing a game to learn about systems thinking and design thinking. There was nothing that was very satisfying out there. And when we came up to the table, it set the conditions for people to be extremely creative and just try things that didn't work. It doesn't matter. But this understanding that everything that was created became a stepping stone to reach this game that we had in mind. And we are facing the same sort of process with a new game we want to develop to contribute to cultural evolution, transformation in the national security team in Canada, but also across NATO members and partners. And it's not that it's impossible, but for instance, if we talk about issues like sexual harassment, like inclusivity and all that, I'm frightened. I don't have an answer of how we can create a game that may contribute to this, but I have hope that we're going to get there. And it's super sensitive. But at the same time, that's what makes it so stimulating, because it's both a very important cause, but it's also extremely stimulating intellectually about how might we get there. So I would say in the end, it's just don't be afraid to go into the impossible, because that's the impossible that, create the motivation and to break this impossible, this feeling.
Yeah, I mean, you put the nail on the head in terms of like games allow for some really cool creative moments, and I think it's important not to shy away from allowing that to occur. I mean, the creativity, the expression, the agency that can come through playing alone is so potent, and finding ways to allow us to express that and engage in that is really powerful. And so I just want to echo what you're saying, but in terms of like next steps as well, there's always new directions that we can take things in. And I mentioned before, like games aren't always the answer, but they're also an answer that isn't always explored. And so when you're thinking about like, we're back at this issue for like the X number of times, well, have you tried looking at games as a method to solve it? What resources and mediums have you looked at? Maybe games are underused in that space. And why? Is it because no one's been thinking about them or interested in it? Or is it because it actually didn't work? And typically it's the former, not the latter answer in that response. And so for me, Lizards and Lies was a prototype. It was asking, how can we look at disinformation, not from a like, how do we fact check it, but from how does it work perspective. And the game does that, but it also creates its own tensions where it's trying to both teach you and show you a system. And that can be really hard in classrooms. I mentioned before, it's like 2 hours long and teachers don't like that. So when we were talking about future steps and next directions, I'm breaking it into 2 other games now. I mean, Lizards and Lies will stay as Lizards and Lies, and I'm always happy to run and talk about that game because it does its job well. But I'm moving into making kind of tools and resources and games that are targeted at, school children, so they can understand why disinformation comes up on their newsfeed, not from a how do I deal with it, but how does this actually lead to what I'm seeing, as well as working with stakeholders to make games that fit into the challenges and concerns they have around the systems that are behind it, because there's so many layers to that onion that I'm trying to unpeel. So.
Well, I want to thank you both for a fantastic conversation on serious games. I've certainly learned a lot. If our audience wants to get in touch with you, learn more about your game, how can they do that?
I mean, I got all the socials, which I think so. I got X, formerly known as Twitter. I have LinkedIn. You can email me at scottbdejong, DEJONG, @gmail.com, or you can just Google Lizards and Lies and you'll see the website for it come up. But I'm always happy to either consult or talk about this stuff or engage in it or just give you feedback on what you're doing. There's not a lot of us out here making serious games. We're growing, and I'm happy every time I meet someone. So if you're interested in working in this space, I'm happy to work alongside you.
Yeah, so likewise, the way we work at AOD for games, that we developed a project community or community of interest on the game, and we have this principle of up on, up off, because everybody is busy. So sometimes if you want to join, you can join midway in the project, contribute as a playtester or in contributing with content and all that. Up off later, and that's totally fine. So, and for that, you can just join us at info@aodnetwork.ca, and we'll link you up with the project lead. But for Breakthrough in itself, we have a fantastic brochure you can find on the website aodnetwork.ca, and also you can reach us out to organize a demo of the game, or even a full session for you and your team. It's a pleasure. Right now, a lot of organizations are using it. RCMP, Bank of Canada, Canadian School of Public Service, and it's growing. So that's fantastic. So please be one of them.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, and we'll definitely put some information perhaps on the website next to this podcast that helps our audience find your contact information.
Yep.
Thank you.
Donna.